Okay. Welcome to the Genetic Genius podcast, Dr. Katelyn. I'm super excited to have you today on the show. And we're going to be diving deep into talking about the immune system and how stress is a component. But first, I'd love for you to tell the audience just about yourself, what you do in this world as a health practitioner and wonderful doctor, and what your impact is on the planet.
Wow, great question. Deep questions. Start with the good ones. So yeah, I'm Dr. Katelyn Kalstein. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Lulu. This is great. I'm so excited to talk about this topic. It's so important for people to understand, and that gets into my mission, which is, as a naturopathic physician like yourself, one of our most valued principles is teaching and education. And so I really have found in my personal life with my own personal mental health and physical health that education is key. That when I understand what's going on in my body, I can stop kind of judging myself so much, and I start really understanding how things are working, and that knowledge really is power. And once you understand how your body works, how your mind works, you can start to relate to it in a very different way. And so what I do in practice is, I do see patients in private practice in a primary care clinic here in Los Angeles. I do integrative mental health and ketamine therapy for depression. And really my focus is on educating my patients first and foremost.
That's great. Yeah, education, like you said, is so key, right? Because as we call it in naturopathic medicine, docere, doctor is teacher. And there's so many people that want to learn how to take better care of themselves every day, especially right now during our wonderful quarantine period,
Yeah.
where everybody's learning, I can exercise more and sleep better. Yeah. So let's dive into what I really want to talk about today is like that mental health component but really stress and how it's impacting the immune system. So let's just talk about stress in the beginning. So how do you think stress affects the body? What are some of the factors that contribute to stress in our daily lives?
Yeah, great question. So stress is subjective, right? So something that stresses me out is not going to be the same thing that stresses you out. Right. So we first have to, when we're trying to understand the stress response, we first have to identify what triggers, and that is a word that's thrown around a lot, but that's what it is. Something in the either external environment or in the internal, yourself, like your thoughts, can create a stress response. And so I think it's important when we start talking about stress, because we tend to use this word very broadly, and as if it's the same for everyone. So for your listeners to really take a look in inventory of their life and say, okay, what for me is the cause of stress? And then to go further with that. So let's say that money stresses me out, right? Money is a common one for a lot of people,
right?
Especially right now, finances or job security, or, and it goes on a continuum from how am I going to feed myself and my family to, well, I was really planning on having this great vacation that now I can't have, right? So
right.
there's a continuum. And what one of my acupuncture teachers, I'm also an acupuncturist, and what one of my acupuncture professors in school said to me that always stuck with me, and I think is very true when you look at how the brain responds to stress, is that all stress is fear. So stress, when we talk about a stress response, we're really talking about a fear response. And stress is kind of our politically correct way or socially acceptable way of saying I'm scared.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're talking about money stresses me out. I'm scared I can't feed my family. I'm scared I won't be able to take care of myself. I'm all of these things, right? So it's a fear response. So understanding that your brain is going into that fear response. The brain doesn't know what stress is. The brain knows fear.
Right. Oh my
right?
God,
Which
that's
is
so true.
which is a threat, right? And so, to answer your question of what does stress, I don't know if you even asked this, what does stress do to the body?
Yes.
Right.
Totally.
And it's different for everyone. And again,
Yeah.
so I think, so going back, knowing what causes that fear response in you is key, because then you can identify, you can kind of get one up on it, and you can say, okay, I'm, because what usually happens is we find out that we're stressed later, like after we've already gone down this rabbit hole, and after we've already reacted, automatically we react. Then we're like, oh, I'm stressed. But part of the goal for me and my patients and in my education is to get people to notice at the very onset so that they can intervene at that moment before, the cascade has happened. And we can talk later about what the cascade is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So for everyone, the trigger is going to be different. So identifying for yourself, because stress is subjective, and then also identifying your response pattern. So we do have some kind of things in common that we all do as humans, as mammals. The fight or flight response is a very common thing that most people have heard of. And this is a response that releases cortisol and epinephrine, and it triggers the sympathetic nervous system, right? So this is the response that has evolved in us when we saw a tiger, right? When we've evolved and we saw this threat, and immediately our heart rate jumps up. We start breathing fast. Our blood goes to our muscles and away from our internal organs so that we can run. Our pupils get wider. We're on alert. We are like, you've never been more focused than when you're in a sympathetic state, right? Which can be a positive too, by the way. It can
sometimes you focus, want that.
Right. Focus and concentration. And sometimes you don't want that. And for sure, so my point is, in the moment, it absolutely serves a purpose so that you can run away from the tiger, right? That's your body working for you. In the long term, it's detrimental to your health. And so if your sympathetic nervous system is being activated every day, because every day you wake up and you turn the news on and there's the tiger again.
Yeah.
Right. Because now the tiger's everywhere. So that's the sympathetic response, and that's the fight or flight. But then there's also this other response, that's the freeze response. And that's the one we don't talk about a lot. And this is from the polyvagal theory. Dr. Stephen Porges outlined this, and it was a wonderful observation that he made that, hey, not everybody reacts with fight or flight. Some people go blank. And you can do both. So some people go into this freeze response where they actually shut down and they feel paralyzed and they feel like they can't make a decision. And so we call that immobilization, whereas the fight or flight people are mobilizers. They want to get something done. Right. When they feel under threat, the only thing that makes them feel safe is productivity.
Yeah.
And the freeze people, and you could be both at different times in your life, or even with different triggers. The freeze people will shut down and they'll go blank.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a really big overview of how the nervous system responds to stress.
Yeah, I love that. And, especially right now, let's talk a little bit more about fear, since I was going to talk about it later, but you already dove into it. So let's just do it now. What I've been thinking about with the COVID virus is that it really is almost like a virus of fear. And I wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on what you think that long-term impact is going to be from that mental health perspective. Like, if some people are like, oh my gosh, they're thriving in it and they're ahead of the game, like you said, like that productivity is at 100% or more. But then there's also people who are having that are maybe have had some mental health conditions before or respond differently to stress, that are this fear factor is really making a larger impact on their health. And I wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I just had a conversation with one of our old teachers, Dr. Brad Lichtenstein, a couple of days ago, and that kind of conversation is still reverberating in my head. And we talked a lot about safety,
Yeah.
And right now we are, and by the way, to go back, anytime you're feeling afraid, that is because you feel in some way you're being threatened, right? Your safety is being threatened. And people can understand that, but where we get it wrong is we think it has to be a conscious fear, and it doesn't, right? So you could go half your day and all of a sudden you have a headache, 3:00 in the afternoon, you have a headache and you're like, what's going on? And then you look back on your day and you take a moment of mindfulness and you're like, wow, I have been running, I haven't had a sip of water all day.
Right.
Because I've been going nonstop. And so yes, maybe the headache is a dehydration headache, but it was really caused by you felt some unconscious threat to your safety, right? You felt unsafe in some way. And I think that no matter people are dealing with this, meaning what their reaction to the quarantine and to this pandemic is. We are all feeling a shaking of our foundation because our structure, our whole life structure has changed without our input, right? So we have this situation where there is, number one, there is a huge amount of uncertainty, even about how this virus works. Like we don't even understand, we don't really understand it. So it would be one thing if the enemy was known.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
If we understood what it was and we were like, okay, this is how you get it. This is, these are the people that are going to get sick. You're going to be immune after you have it. If all of these questions were answered, we could kind of get our head around it and say, okay, I can, but it's just constant uncertainty. And for me as a healthcare provider, I mean, I've been feeling this very deeply that I don't even know who to trust anymore as well.
Yeah.
Because one day, there's one PhD immunologist saying, well, this is how the virus works. And then there's another PhD immunologist saying, that's not right. We don't really, and so it's like, right. And so there's so much uncertainty. So I think number one, it's really important for people to understand that whatever you're feeling is okay and is appropriate. Like we are all in a very unprecedented time with a lot of uncertainty. And when we feel like we don't have agency, I see that being a big issue, is that all of this is kind of happening outside of our control. We live in a huge country. We're not Sweden. We're not this kind of we have very different ideologies throughout the whole country. We are a big country. We are an individualistic country. And so we're being asked to come together, and it's very, very difficult because we don't have individual agency right now. Right? To say, well, actually I am going to go back to work. Well, you might be the only one there. If you go back to work, there's so much out of our control.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Yes. And, I think one of the things too, what I liked about what you're saying is, it creates a different opportunity for us as the nation to come together in that community aspect, which, we've seen so many different aspects of community come to the surface, which really then helps everyone to deal with what we're talking about here is stress. Because reach out to your best friend that you haven't spoken to in the year, and how can you tune in and talk about what's bothering you as a way to have that outlet, or what's your trigger, as you spoke about earlier.
Yes. I just want to interrupt you there, because to bring that back to the nervous system, when we talk about the stress response, that's actually not the first thing that happens. So when your brain, and we have attributed this to the amygdala, to a little almond-shaped structure on either side of the corpus callosum. You have two, kind of in the center of your brain, and it's part of the limbic system, which is long believed to be the seat of emotions in the brain. It's where our memories are stored. It's where when we have an emotion, that area, the brain lights up, right? And we have a strong emotion. And so what happens when that area gets triggered is, and we still don't understand how this works, but somehow our brain perceives a threat. And again, this is subconscious. And by subconscious, I don't mean esoterically, I mean literally our prefrontal cortex below it, right below the conscious part of our brain, in the limbic system, it perceives a threat. And actually the first thing that we do as mammals is we look for help.
Yeah, exactly.
We search our environment for support. And then if we look around and we see that we're alone, or we feel, we perceive that there's no support, then we go into our stress response.
Right.
And so I think that that's so important for people. It's so compelling to understand that that's how our nervous system is wired. We are tribal. We are a tribal species. We are meant to be together. We have this illusion now that we kind of can do it on our own, because, hey, look, everyone in New York, I have one of my best friends in New York, he's been in his apartment by himself for 4 weeks.
Oh, that's crazy.
So in his mind, he has this illusion that he's alone, and he doesn't, but his water runs because of his plumber. He's getting his food because of his farmer. He can, like all of these things, we are so connected, and we don't see it because of this illusion of our separate houses. But that's how we're wired. We are wired to look for help. And when we don't have that help, that's when we go into the kind of negative stress response.
Right. That emotional response, which then can be also a physical response. It depends on the person, right?
It's both. It's
Yeah.
always both. And
Yeah.
it's a survival instinct. And that's
Right.
what I think the thing that really hit home for me when I first started learning about this and how the nervous system was wired was that we have to be compassionate with ourselves in watching these responses, because
Mhm.
they are really your nervous system trying to protect you.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with you. It's no fault of your own. And it's this judgment that gets in. Why am I behaving this way? Because people know logically that they don't want to be stressed.
Right.
Right? Logically,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, stop feeling this way.
Stop feeling stressed. Yeah.
Stress is bad. Don't be stressed. But it's automatically happening anyway. And so the answer is not to say it doesn't
Right.
exist or to wish it were some other way, but instead to have compassion and say, okay, my nervous system is activated right now
Mm-hmm.
because it believes that I'm under threat. And in some ways I am, and that's okay. You
Right.
know, and being compassionate with yourself and with your reactions.
Yeah. And knowing the tools, how, like you said, when you have that response come up, what's in your toolbox, especially from the naturopathic perspective, what's in our toolbox that we can help our patients with, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I also wanted to talk to you about, so that emotional component, can we look at the hereditary aspect? So there's two parts of that, I guess, in my question. One is, we have the hereditary response. We might have grown up in an environment, let's say, that was stressful for us, and then it creates that stress response. So I'd like to talk about that. And the other component of that is I just am curious about what you think about the past life perspective. So if we're talking about a bloodline that's, traces back to, who knows, but maybe, 1800 or something. What's your thoughts about does that stress have a factor in our life today? So that's, I know, two large questions. So just didn't want to forget.
Okay. So starting with kind of your biological family in this life, that was your question, right?
Yeah. Yes. The hereditary. Yep. Yeah, mm-hmm.
The hereditary stuff. So I think that, right, I mean, this is nature versus nurture question, right? Ultimately.
Yep.
And there's a couple pieces. I do believe that we learn a stress response, right? So we can see how our parents or how the other people in our home are responding to stress, and we can learn that as well. And it is also, it's very much related to what happened for us individually between the third trimester when you were
Mm-hmm.
in your mother's womb and 7 years of life.
Wow.
Maybe
Yeah.
maybe
Right.
9, it depends, right?
It depends on
But
you.
during that time is when the nervous system is developing, and there are studies showing that women who are exposed to stress or higher
Mm-hmm.
levels of cortisol and epinephrine, as we can measure, kind of those are our measurements of stress, even though they're not even really great, because there's so much happening in the body that we can't necessarily look at, right, in the blood, that those children go on to have higher rates of mental illness and more susceptible to PTSD. They have attention issues. They have essentially nervous system dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
So there is certainly, even as our brains are developing and growing in our mother, there are effects that can impact how we respond to stress and how resilient we are.
Right.
So absolutely. And then as a child, everyone has some type of developmental trauma. Some people have trauma with a capital T,
Right.
and that's like abuse, like,
Yeah.
kind of overt abuse. But most of us, even if we didn't have that, we had at some point in our childhood, our needs weren't met.
Yeah.
I mean, parents aren't
growing
perfect.
up.
It's part of growing up. And that happened to our parents, and that happened to their parents, and some are, to put a judgment on it, some are worse than others, or some are more intense than others. And so what happens though, as we develop, is we learn what behaviors will make us more safe. We learn what behaviors will prevent us from being harmed, right, in those situations. And so if you had a very like loud, cruel, abusive, emotionally abusive father, you would learn to be quiet, to shut down, because then you're not going to trigger him, maybe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your nervous system does learn what is best for your survival. But then later on in life, if that was you, and now you're in a marriage, and when things get tough, you shut down, that's not necessarily the best
solution.
yeah, it's not the best solution, because in a marriage you need to kind of show up and you need to be able to communicate. You need to, and so shutting down can be detrimental. And so what worked for you in the past as a child is not working for you anymore.
Yeah.
And again, so much of this is education and knowledge, because once you realize, oh yeah, when I was a kid, I really had to shut down in order to not be yelled at. And that made sense for me then.
Right.
But now I can't do that. Like, I'm an adult now. And so when you understand that, then you can start to change it.
Yeah, it's so true. And I see that with patients, it's like a pattern. Sometimes they're not even aware of it, or they've so suppressed it or hidden it from their memory because it's so harmful, or, can be so painful, I guess it's a better word, to them.
Yeah.
And even to bring it up, it's like, sometimes it takes that like nurturing, right? And allowing them that space to really express that. And then they can start to see the patterns, like, oh, wow, that's how I communicate, like you said, with my partner when I'm in that stressful situation. And then teaching them those new techniques to help them deal with it in a different way, or it can become a new person and communicating a completely new way.
And it's by design, it's not revealed.
Right.
So by design, it's hidden, because if we knew about it, it wouldn't be automatic. Right.
Totally.
If we had conscious control over it, it wouldn't make any sense. It's like we were actually designed and we've evolved to have this automatic response so that we don't have to think. Because when you see the tiger, you don't want to have to go, what should I do?
Right. What should I do now?
I think I should. You don't want to sit there and deliberate. You
Right.
want to act immediately.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing with these, these new stress responses, which are interpersonal, right? So the threat is no longer the tiger, because we've dealt with that. We've secured a place in the world where we're safe from wildlife for the most part. And so now it's all interpersonal dynamics that are threatening, a lot of them, especially as a kid.
Right.
Right. So you want those responses to be automatic to protect you. And so it is, this has been incredibly challenging for me too, because people who are, the smarter you are, the harder it is. Right. I'm not saying I'm like a smart person, but you try to think your way through it, and you're like, I'm going to think my way through this, and I'm going to find the answer. And it doesn't quite work that way. Like you said, it takes nurturing, and it really have to feel safe in order to access those parts.
Yeah, we can totally overthink things as humans, right? The ego takes over and we start to overthink.
And it's that ego, that's exactly it. And that's kind of the word that I use as well. And I like to couple it with parts of the brain, right? Like the default mode network and this automatic part of the brain. And the idea that maybe let's not vilify the ego, but maybe let's see it as the part of ourselves that's wired for survival. And the ego is really that voice that's saying, I don't know, be careful here. And as an adult, when you grow up and you learn this, and it's like Maya Angelou, once you know better, you do better, right? But before you know better, you can't do better. But once you understand that your ego is there to protect you, and that these behaviors that are now maybe dysfunctional or not adaptive for you once were adaptive, then you can say, notice when that voice comes up. Right. And the voice goes, oh, I don't know. And you go, I appreciate you. I hear you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to choose whatever I want to choose.
Right. I'm going to choose a different response in this moment.
Yeah. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice.
And training. And maybe training is kind of a strange word, but like, mindfulness practice, I guess is a better word, and
that's it.
And tuning into our what our true inner being wants, instead of the ego has its own agenda, which can be helpful, like you said, in those times when we're running from the tiger. But what is our true self? And especially like right now when we have this fear around us and we're more susceptible to it, how do we then swim through that energetic fear but not soak it in like a big sponge?
Yeah. And it's like, that's it, is that the ego is, I tell all of my patients with mental, what we call mental health issues or depression, your ego does not care. And this can be, you could substitute ego for brain. Your brain does not care if you're happy.
Right.
It wants to survive. that is the drive of
Yeah.
being, and that is the balance of being a spiritual being, which, you know, I believe we are, in a
Yeah.
human body, is that we are animals, and we
Yes.
forget that. You know, we judge ourselves so much because we do have this higher consciousness, and we do know so many things intellectually, and yet it feels sometimes like our body, or the mammal in us, the animal in us, is betraying us.
Right. To come
Right.
from that place. Mhm.
Yeah, it feels that way. But to have that I think is the spiritual lesson, is can you have, like, how much compassion for yourself can you have?
Yeah.
Right.
And that can be a hard place to come from sometimes when you're in that stress space of
Oh,
of patterning. Yeah.
100%.
hmm let's see. Okay, so I wanted to go back to the second part of the question.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
past life.
yeah, just because I think it's an interesting aspect, and then we'll go into the genetic component a little bit. So because I think, from that, if we're talking about the spiritual aspect and how our body has a memory, and studies are now being shown that from the genetic component, we can trace things back to more than like 6 generations of lifetime. And that's like just with our brains are learning to learn more, right? As we're studying. So if we're thinking about like, okay, well, if I was this, I don't know, a warrior back in the 1800s or something, how does that affect me now? And does it carrying through like all my genes, from not only from the physical perspective, but also from that emotional trigger perspective?
Yeah. It's a deep question. And
Yeah, it is.
and if I'm going to be honest, the answer is I don't know.
Yeah, and that's totally fine.
Because in anything I would say has been from people who have maybe experienced that, because I don't feel like it's kind of this whole thing about uh, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence,
Right.
right?
Yep.
So
Mm-hmm.
we don't have evidence one way or the other, except for the individuals who have gone there and
Yeah.
have experienced this themselves. And I had a spiritual teacher who could do that, and he could astrally travel, and he could see all of how all of that tied in together. And I believe that it is absolutely a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to rule that out as being something that is affecting us today. And I do think that, and this is just my own belief, it's not just my own belief, and what I've come to in thinking through, is that exactly what we were kind of meant to, if you will, deal with in this life has shown up in this life.
Right.
So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that we have to go back to past lives. And I think this can be mainly a huge distraction for people,
Mm-hmm.
is that they actually use it as an excuse, if you will, to dissociate from what's happening in this life and say, oh, well, it's my past life, and I
Right.
have to go back, and I have to like fix things in my past life. And I think that if we trust the process of the universe, if we trust the process of evolution, that we probably brought in everything that we needed to work on. And we have, as my teacher would say, we have all the material here.
Right. Exactly.
So it's very interesting it's a very interesting imagination experiment to go, okay, it was my past life. And for sure, if an individual, and I've had these people, and I've had this experience, if you have dreams of something in your past life,
Mm-hmm.
if it comes to you in this life to work on it, then okay. But don't go searching for
Right.
something in your past life to fix, because you're avoiding what's right here in front of you.
Right. And that's so true. And, it's like, if we can be in this lifetime and take every like magic gem that we've learned and bring it forward. I think that's what you were saying, that's exactly what I think, the same thing. It's like, be in the present moment and be a step ahead and use those tools, and like, use that knowledge that you've brought into this life and to move forward and find the best happiness that you can from that.
Yeah.
Genetic
It makes
component.
sense. It makes sense to me that kind of energies or resonances of past life stuff is what is what attracted me to my parents, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why was I born to a workaholic mother when someone else was born to a mother who left them, or
Mm-hmm.
someone else was born to a mother who was like totally present and stay-at-home mom.
Right.
But like, I was born to this mother who is a wonderful person, but didn't give me a lot of what I needed emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I look back, I think it has to make sense that this was just the lesson that I needed in this life.
Yeah.
And that was
Mm-hmm.
coming from past lives, but it came through in this one, right? So I don't really need to go into all the other ones
No.
to
Yeah.
work on it.
Yeah. You made your own path through this one. Like you said, like, choosing, and then it has given you the path to this amazing doctor that you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything. Yeah.
It all adds up.
it can't be argued against that everything that is exactly as it's supposed to be. Right.
Right. It's exactly. I wanted to ask about your thoughts about the environment that we live in. Now I'm talking more about kind of like environmental toxicities, but that can also be from the emotional toxicity perspective, and how that plays a role in the actual like cellular aspect. So I'm talking about, let's say you were brought up in a traumatic environment nutritionally and that change your actual cellular makeup is how you develop when you're talking about through that birth through age 8 or 9, and what impact that has on the mental health state of mental health and stress. Does that make sense? Did I get that question out?
I think so. I think what I understood is this is like ACEs, right? Adverse childhood events.
Yep.
And that could be, like you said, it could be mental, emotional, most of the ACEs, and for your listeners who don't know what that is, ACEs is a way to track what happened to you in childhood, essentially, with your current mental health. I mean, that's basically, and they've used this in many different, they use ACEs in a lot of different psychological studies to track how what happens to us in childhood affects us now. And what we found and what we've seen is that there are absolutely correlations. This stuff is fascinating, that the more ACEs that you've had, the more likely you are to have depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar, the more susceptible you are to PTSD after a trauma. It is just like 30, 40 years later, right? Something that happened to you in childhood. And then to your question about like nutrition, and this is huge. And it's huge. And I tell my patients, on the one hand, we are very resilient. On the one hand, I grew up eating Pop-Tarts and Hamburger Helper. I grew up eating, I was thinking back, I think I had ice cream every night of my childhood. Like my mom wasn't a cook. My mom worked all the time. My father left when I was 2. And my father also was very, did not have a lot of money. And so we ate when I was with him. After a few years, I reconnected with him.
Yeah.
And when I was, 5, 6, 7, all we would eat was fast food. That's all he could afford.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I get that. And then my mom, on the other hand, just didn't cook. And so we had access to stuff, and we could have had organic, and we could have, but it just wasn't a thing. And so, we are very resilient, because once I came to Southern California for college, I was like, whoa, what's organic? And like, what's kale? Like, I had never heard of, I didn't know what kale was. I know a lot of people were like that as well. And now I feel like I'm a pretty healthy person. Now I still struggle with my, addictions and habits, because I really do think, and what happened for me, and I'm sure there are people out there who will resonate with this, my mother would substitute food for love.
Right. So
and I'm giving my mom a hard time on this podcast.
Mom, if you're listening, we love you.
I love you. You did the best you could with what you had. 100, you're great. And she worked a lot, and I remember seeing a picture of me with this gigantic candy cane. Those
right.
that are
all wound up. Yeah.
At Christmas time, they're 1.5 feet long.
Totally.
They're 12 inches. I was in a car seat, couldn't walk, and I had one of those in my hand. Yeah. And I think, and as we know, mice will choose sugar over cocaine.
Yeah.
So sugar is incredibly addictive. It releases dopamine in the brain, and you get this reward, and it's an addiction, 100%. And
100%. Yep.
I started that really young, and I think that my brain associated love and nurturing with sugar. And so, because that's what was there for me, sugar was there for me. Sugar didn't talk back. Sugar didn't, it wasn't conditional.
No conditional love. Right.
Yeah. So that was my main form of pleasure as a kid.
Yeah. And it's for many people.
for a lot of people, and it's not just sugar, it's just food in general, because that's our sustenance, right? That's, and what I hear a lot of people who have serious food addictions is, you know, that just what I said, it's not, food's never going to stop loving me. It's always going to be there.
Exactly.
And so there's, you know, there's this relationship with food as well. And my point was, you know, but now I'm in a place where I feel like I'm very healthy, and I still struggle at times. And, you know, the body is so resilient, and what you're feeding it, both with nutrition, but also your thoughts, is incredibly powerful. And at the same time that we see these ACEs and these adverse childhood events can affect people 50 years later, we also see radical healing happening in minutes. You know, like I remember when I was a student and I was doing work at the Bastyr Integrative Oncology Center. It was a research center for cancer patients, and looking at what alternative treatments might be beneficial for cancer. We had a patient there with stage 4 brain cancer, a really aggressive brain cancer. And I remember reading her chart before going into the room and saying, this doesn't make sense. She was diagnosed with stage 4 3 years ago. How is she like
still functioning?
I asked Dr. Standish, my attending, I said, this is wrong, right? Like she can't still be alive. And she was like, nope, she's still, and I walked in the room, I had this visit with her, and I said, and it, you know, after half an hour or so, I was going through her supplements and going through her medication. I just put the chart down and I said, what did you do?
How did you change it?
How did you? And she said, I had a love-in. She had one love-in.
Wow.
You know what a love-in is? I didn't know what it was.
Tell our listeners so that you can describe it. It's not like the hippie love-in image I think people are thinking about.
I mean, I still don't know what it is, but what she described to me was she invited everyone who she loved over, you know, people who loved her, friends, family, people close to her. She sat in the middle of the living room and everyone sat around her loving her. Like,
wow.
I think they, you know, at one time they just gently touched her. They said prayers on her. They filled the room with this energy of love for her and healing. And she believed, she believed that that's what did it. And she said she went back and had her brain scanned a couple weeks after that, and the tumor had shrunk.
Wow. That's so powerful. And especially now when we're isolated in this different way. I mean, you know, you can have 100 people still in that kind of like virtual love-in. And if we did that planetary perspective, maybe we could have all the fear about the virus just vanish.
And by the way, it's free.
Yeah, it's free.
What else are we doing? Watching Netflix?
Right.
Like, might as well send some love and energy. Who knows if it works? It might be totally bogus, you know, who knows? But for this woman, what's really important in what we know, what we've seen in studies, is that if you believe it, then it works.
Exactly. The power of your own belief in yourself and is the most powerful medicine on the planet, right? That's how placebo works.
And you can't, but the thing is, you can't phone it in, you know, and they've done a lot of studies on spontaneous healing where they tell people, you need to believe that you can heal. And they're like, okay, I'll believe it. And they don't, it's not part of their worldview. It's so foreign to them. Like this individual who did this love-in and healed herself from stage 4 brain cancer, she bought in, right? So like she believed that it could work. She believed that what she was doing was effective. And I believe that that's why it worked, is because she really believed it. And that's something that you can't necessarily force on someone.
Right. And if you believe like 100% of something with every cell of your body, you make it happen. Yeah. It's like, you know, somebody could say, oh, you'll never do that. You're like, of course I will, because you know, if you believe in it, then you make it happen. And you can do that with anything, I think, you know. And
that's the difference. That's a really important point. And it's the difference between positive thinking and positive feeling. Yeah. Right. And when you listen to people who are kind of masters in this arena, like Joe Dispenza, for example, he talks about, and I think this is really important because there's a lot of books and there's a lot of talk out there about the power of positive thinking, right? And just say your affirmations. And that only works if you really feel it. And that's the part that people, I think, skip. They're like, okay, I'm just going to tell myself I'm healthy. You have to feel, like you said, in every cell of your body, it has to resonate that it is already. Right. Yeah. And that's when it manifests.
Totally. It's like you drink the magic Kool-Aid, but the Kool-Aid is like your like belief, it's like,
by the way, and if you're feeling it, then it already is.
yeah, it already
So
happened.
that's incredible.
Totally. I wanted to go back and talk about something you were talking about, addictions and food, and a lot of patients I see, is you see as well. It's like they use food as it creates this like safety bubble, and especially with weight loss, they've used the food as this constant, like, this shell to make them feel better. And from that stress perspective and mental health, it's like, how do you break the bubble, so to speak, of that shield, that safety shield? What are your thoughts about that? Like, because it can be so hard for patients and for listeners out there. Like, it's almost like sometimes you feel that shield, that bubble around you with all different things, from like you were talking about earlier with money, different things. And how do you, like, what are your tools that you use to break through the bubble or the shield?
Yeah. So the first step is, if someone's having difficulty or resistance to letting the shield down, which the first question is, do they have to let the shield down? Right. And who's saying that they do? And do they want to? And if they say, no, I do want to, because this is no way to live, I feel like I'm in prison, which you hear a lot of people say, which is interesting, right? The visualization, they really feel like they're locked in and they're stuck and they're in prison. They have to feel safe.
Yeah.
I mean, you just said it. It's like, how did they let go of that safety shield? I would say you never let go of the safety shield. Right. But you let go of the illusion that food gives you the safety shield.
Exactly.
Or that whatever it is, money gives you the safety shield, or whatever.
Yeah.
So feeling safe and practicing feeling safe. And how do you do that? You practice. Like,
you practice. Yeah, exactly.
You practice feeling safe. In some patients that I work, and I'm sure you've seen these people as well, when you take them through an exercise, and this is a very simple, by the way, having someone working with you and witnessing you is way more powerful than doing this on your own in the beginning.
Right.
Because that witnessing of having someone there with you, it's like you're being kind of put on the spot in a way, but in a way that you feel held, which is very important. And so having rapport is really important with the person. But this is a really simple, just sitting and breathing and closing your eyes and saying, do you feel safe? What is it? And just naming it and putting your attention there. I mean, it's surprising how little we actually do the things that we talk about.
Right. Totally. I know. Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, safety. And well, have you ever actually sat down and said, am I safe? Do I feel safe? And like, what does safety feel like to you? Yeah. And you'll start to, when you kind of ask these questions and you actually shut up and listen for the answer, because we are addicted to thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking is our safety shield.
Yeah.
And we think that, oh, I'm just going to think about feeling safe. Right. And
it doesn't always work that way.
So many patients think about feeling instead of feeling. They think what they feel instead of feel what they feel. You ask them, how do you feel? I think I feel.
Right. Yeah. I think I feel scared or whatever. Because
they don't want to actually go into the feeling, which is understandable, because the feeling doesn't feel good. Yeah. And so we're wired to go towards pleasure and away from pain. And if the feeling of fear doesn't feel good, which it doesn't, then we're going to run from that. Yeah. And so it's about creating a safe enough space that you can, you take a breath and you actually feel, God, I'm scared right now.
Right. You can breathe.
You can breathe. And what's interesting is when you really drop into that, so much of the weight and the potency just disappears. Because you're just sitting with it, and it's like, this sadness that I've been holding, this grief, this shame, this fear, this anxiety, all of that. When you actually face it and come into contact with it, your power is so much greater than any of those emotions that are, by the way, just energy and motion, right? They're just transient. And it really is true that the biggest fear, or fear of fear, What's the saying that I'm trying to think of?
I can't think of what it is.
Fear itself. Something.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. Yes. That's what it is.
But when you actually just sit with it, you realize like, oh, it's not that scary. Like it loses so much weight when you bring attentive mindfulness to it.
Yeah. And that's one of the solutions are so easy. It's like we as a society have become so problem oriented, right? It's like, if we could just focus on it being like a solution oriented and just like, here's the solution, here it is. And then feeling the emotion within it, like, yes, and I can feel this. And then there's the solution. Like it just opens so many doors.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a self-correcting system.
Yeah.
It really is. So the moment, the mindfulness part, just it is incredible how many times I've forgotten that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another thing, about mindfulness, is that people expect to sit down once and be a master at meditation or a master at mindfulness. And I can tell you, in 17 years of me practicing meditation in one form or another, I am shocked at how often I still am like, oh, I'm doing it again.
Right. Yeah.
Again. And it's that is the practice.
Yes.
Right. You would never expect an athlete to be able to go out on the field and do what he does the first time. They practice every single day. And by the way, athletes and musicians and masters, they visualize what they're going to do too before they do it. Yeah. And so I think visualizing yourself in safety, visualizing yourself like with part of that shield down, but still feeling safe, is incredibly important.
Oh, that's so true. I love that. That visualization is so key. And, going back to what you were saying before about, you can affirm till you're dead and dying on the planet. But if you're not visualizing, like, I am well, I'm safe, and you can do that through all different ways, and practice that, with a practitioner, like you were just saying, is so important. So you can have that kind of like as the rhythm, and then starting to do your own practice at home, creating that, like in the routine, I guess is what I'm trying to say, like that, where it becomes like natural in your environment. Let's talk a little bit about stress in the immune system. So we talked about kind of like that fear perspective. And so how does stress impact the immune system? And I know there's like tons of studies that have been done, right, about the different ways, but I would love your expertise about how you see like that. Let's talk about some of the major components. And then we'll talk about how patients or our listeners can then use some things to help with boosting their immune system with the practice.
Sure. So let's assume that we'll take the two separately. So the stress response of fight or flight, or sympathetic activation. So these are the people who need to be moving. They're moving constantly. They're like busy little bees. They can't stop. When they stop, they feel threatened. Whether consciously or unconsciously. When they stop, it's uncomfortable.
Right. Breathing. They're like, they never breathe.
They never breathe. Yeah. They never, that feels really, that's me. That's my go-to. If I'm not being productive, I'm shaming myself, right? Because productivity is my response to feeling like I'm not in control.
Right.
So what happens when this system is activated is it's sympathetic activation. So it is cortisol is released. So corticotropin releasing factor is released in the brain, which then tells the adrenal glands to release cortisol. So these are kind of two different ways. Epinephrine and cortisol have synergistic effects on the body, but they are different, right? So cortisol is a corticosteroid. It's a steroid hormone. Epinephrine is also made in the adrenal glands in a different part, but it also is in really high concentration in the nervous system, right? And so what happens when your sympathetic system is activated is your heart rate goes up.
Yep.
Your breathing is typically more shallow, or you're not breathing at all, like you said. Blood is moved away from the central organs to the periphery, right? So that means that your vital organs, your intestines, your spleen, your heart, your diaphragm, your liver, they're not getting the blood supply that they need.
Yeah, not full functioning.
They're not fully functioning. And then we wonder why we're sick, after doing this stress response every day of our lives for 20 years.
You're like, oh, why am I so constipated?
And then I'm bloated. I don't know why. So the other thing is it causes you to not absorb your food, which I think is really, so what, kind of what we learned in school to understand the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the other side, is rest and digest, right?
Yeah.
So sympathetic and parasympathetic are like two sides of a coin, and it's like acceleration and the brakes, right? And so when you're accelerating with the sympathetic nervous system, the brakes aren't on because you're accelerating, and the parasympathetic system is like the calm. It's what we typically think of as the calming system, right? So it allows our body, it allows our organs to digest, because just think about it. If you're in an activated state and you feel like the tiger is coming to get you, that's not the time to digest your food.
Right. Not like not time to eat.
It's not time to eat.
Right.
And by the way, it's not time to have sex either. So the libido goes.
Everything goes.
Anything that seems your hair, like why grow hair when you're under threat? Like who cares, right?
Yep,
so like people will say that their hair is falling out with stress. Like there's a lot of secondary effects from this
sleep.
one big sleep, like right, because the cortisol and the epinephrine is the alert, right? It's making you alert and on edge and activated and in this kind of beta brainwave state.
Right.
Then of course cortisol has there are cortisol receptors in, I believe, every single organ system. So cortisol, it affects our skin, it affects our fat.
Yep.
So you'll notice that people who are kind of sympathetic people, myself included, if they gain weight, they tend to gain it around the trunk in the midsection.
Yep.
Right. That's kind of the cortisol. And then there are, of course, diseases, like outright diseases of cortisol dysfunction, where people who have lots of cortisol, like in Cushing's disease, they get a really bloated mid-center abdomen here. So you can see weight gain. You see all sorts of different effects for the sympathetic nervous system. And then, so that's kind of the sympathetic people. And so their job, to answer your question about what we can do, and then I'll go to the parasympathetic people. And this is, I can speak to really well because it's me, right? My goal is to feel safe without doing something every second.
Right. Just to what would it be like to not do something? That's me too. Totally.
So my reaction to feeling unsafe, the thing that my body says, okay, I feel unsafe. What's going to make me feel safe again? Just keep doing, go. And so when I notice that I'm doing that, I need to sit down. And against all desire, I mean, every cell in my body wants to be getting up and moving and doing something. I need to make myself sit down and breathe for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And feel safe and remind myself. And this is where the higher cortex comes in. You remind yourself you're safe. You are safe. And then you have that physical experience. And so it's always both. It's never just telling yourself, I'm safe.
Right, with the deer in the headlights look. Yeah.
You don't believe, you're sitting there trying to tell yourself you're safe, but it's so important. I cannot overstress, because all of this is happening in our body. So the fix is in our body. You have to have the same level. You have to match the reaction in the body as well, and sit down and breathe.
Yeah. And breathing, it has so many, like a multitude of effects, on every cell of the body, then feels the benefits. Especially the brain is our huge one, right? But our lungs, and then our blood going through every organ, just like you were talking about.
Yeah. And so this is something from my mentor, if you sat here and
right.
And you breathe in, like take it the extreme, the other way, right? Because we always think it's a top down thing. Like I get stressed up here and then my body reacts.
Right.
But sometimes if you start breathing that way, you'll start to feel anxious, because it's changing the pH in your brain.
Exactly.
Your brain gets the signal that, oh, we're breathing fast. We must be in danger.
Shut down. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then the brain goes, oh. And then what happens in our modern world, because there's not an overt tiger standing there, is we then scan the environment and say, what am I anxious about? I'm anxious. What am I anxious about? And we find something to be anxious about.
Right. Even if it was something deeper.
Just because we weren't breathing. And so the question I always ask is, are you anxious or are you not breathing? Because it could be both. It might be that you're anxious because there's some legitimate, financial stress or job stress or relationship stress. That might be, but it also could be, did you eat gluten yesterday and you're allergic to gluten?
Right.
Did you, and histamine is causing you to feel anxious, but it's really a biological thing? Or are you not breathing? Because if we sit in this position and breathe very shallowly for 5 minutes, you're going to start feeling emotional, what we would call like emotional or mental effects of that.
Yeah. And food, like again, back to the food that you said with gluten, you know, there's so many patients that I see that have that food trigger, and it could be anything, you know, and they're like, oh, well, I ate this food, you know, I had whatever, pizza or something like that, 3 days ago. And like, but I didn't realize it was bothering me until today. You know, it's like, sometimes it's like a hidden almost effect that they then
Yes.
slow, it's like so almost like reduced, you know, it's like the factor, and then they feel it, and then it like starts to build up. They're like, oh gosh, now I realize, you know, what happened.
This is why it's so important to work with a doctor who knows kind of this type of medicine, because and even myself, like I'm bad about it, but I do treat myself, but I try not to, because we are so bad just in general. And we can laugh at this, you know, it's okay to be bad at some things. We are so bad at seeing ourselves objectively and tracking and we need someone outside of ourselves to say, well, what did you on Monday? And you're like, well, oh yeah, I did have that thing. I wasn't even tracking that, because our brains are tracking so many things in our environment that we don't even, I mean, I know that you've experienced this. We'll have patients who we do an initial intake on, and we'll be like, any hospitalizations or surgery? And they'll be like, nope, none. And then like 5 visits later,
yeah, they'd say something.
You're talking to them about, and they're like, oh yeah, I did have my right ovary removed.
Right. And you're like, what?
Like, how could you forget that? But we forget these things.
Right. Especially with trauma.
Yeah. It's this continuum in everything that happens in our life. And so having a doctor or whoever who is qualified, right, to reflect back to us what we're doing and our behavior is so important.
Yeah. That outside perspective can be priceless.
So important.
You know, because we have so much judgment, like you were saying earlier, like on ourselves, and we need that outside perspective, whether it's from a qualified health practitioner or maybe even your best friend who then calls you out on something.
Yes.
You're like, hey, you didn't exercise this morning with me. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Lulu, I do want to go back to finish answering your question.
Oh yes, let's go back. We got sidetracked.
I got sidetracked. So another thing that stress does and cortisol does in the brain is it activates microglial cells in the brain, which is actually a cell of the immune system. We just call it a different name since it's in the brain.
Right.
But it's actually kind of the macrophage of the brain. So yes, our immune system is everywhere.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, we tend to, I don't know what people think of. It's in our brain, it's in our gut, it's in our skin. It is literally, there's nowhere that the immune cells don't go. Yeah. Like they can get through the blood-brain barrier. And so when these macrophages of the brain, these microglial cells are activated, they release pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha and IL-2 and IL-1. And that creates inflammation in the brain. And this often manifests as mental illness. It often manifests as depression. And so there were these groundbreaking studies that were done 6 or 7 years ago showing that these inflammatory markers were elevated in the blood and cerebral spinal fluid of people with depression. And so it sparked this huge question of like, is depression just inflammation?
Right.
Right. And you could say just inflammation, but really when you look back, it's stress.
Yeah.
So my whole model now of depression is it's stress.
It's stress. Yep.
Depression is stress. And it's actual anatomical and structural and chemical changes that happen in the brain from stress over time.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah,
So so it's all of that.
Yeah. And I think stress is probably a component to everything, right? If we went back, like you said, and we're able to look at the root cause as we do as naturopathic physicians, like it always comes back to that component, whether we can recognize it or not, I think is sometimes the key.
Yeah. And one point, yes, that's it. And so then it begs the question, well, what would life be without fear?
Right.
Right. Like, why couldn't we just have life without fear? And that's a great concept, but it's not realistic, right? Because we at the same time that we're really resilient, we're also vulnerable. Like our flesh is kind of vulnerable. And we do have to be aware of threats, and we do have to be aware of danger. And I think that the healthy way to orient to that is when you notice you're afraid, to ask yourself, is this something really worth being afraid of? And it might be. And by the way, that fear, again, is a biological response to tell you to kick into gear and to do something about it.
Right.
And so maybe if we could just, when we notice a fear coming up or we notice a threat, if we could look at it, talk to it, ask it like, what's going on? Yeah, identify it. What's going on here? Is this something I need to be stressed about? And if it's not, if it's something from the past, right? So we often have these patterns that we recognize. That's what our brain does. It recognizes patterns. So sometimes you'll see something like, for example, I just started working at a new clinic, and I'm already noticing that my colleague that I'm working with, I had a kind of traumatic experience from one of my previous clinics working with a colleague, and not like it wasn't a good business situation. And I felt taken advantage of and, all this stuff, which I had a role in as well, for sure. Right. But with this new guy, I'm starting to recognize patterns, and I am approaching him much more causiously because of what happened in the past, right?
Yeah,
which is an appropriate thing.
Right.
I've learned, right? But to say to yourself, okay, is this a worthy fear, or is this a pattern that is not appropriate right now? And then secondly, if it is a worthy fear and it is your body trying to tell you something's not right, then you do something about it. You take some action, and then it's over.
Right.
Right. So
that's the most, I love that. That's the most important thing, right? It's over when we recognize
it's over. And like, what does the deer do when the deer is in the savannah and sees the tiger approaching? The deer looks up, the deer sees that it's a tiger, the deer runs, all unconsciously.
Right.
The deer runs. Like, if the deer gets away from the tiger, it shakes.
Yeah.
It literally shakes it off. You can watch animals do this. They shake off everything because all that energy, they're discharging all this energy.
Yeah. Just like, let it go.
Go back to the watering hole.
Right. That's just like what we need to do, right? Like, oh, look, and then just go back to our daily life, whatever that is.
Shake it off.
Shake it off. Yeah. And expressing it, communicating, I think that because we have a different way, there is some therapy, I know that where they do some kind of like shaking therapy, but I can't remember the name of it right now. But if I do, I'll put it in the show notes. But there, as our body, we have a different stress response, and shaking isn't like we do maybe if we're like super scared, but in our normal everyday life, like if we're at work, we don't usually have this shaking experience because somebody might call us out on it.
Totally. Well, it wouldn't be, it's not socially acceptable.
Right. Yeah.
This spontaneous movement in general is not, we have to sit at our desk in our cubicle and sit like this all day.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what if I feel like kind of,
moving around and dancing?
Moving around, and we could do that in naturopathic.
Right, totally.
Of it.
Yeah.
In general, movement in the body is not okay.
Right. Well, we're going to create new norms.
That's right.
So let's see. I think we addressed both of those aspects. We were talking about how stress affects the immune system. And then, so what are some of your go-tos that you would recommend for our listeners now in ways that maybe let's talk about from some of it could be from nutrition or herbs or exercise, since you have your BS in sports medicine, whatever you think that comes to your mind, just your top 5 that you're like, if I was going to implement these in my daily practice, I would see like immediate results. Does that make sense? Like something that's like a powerhouse.
For stress specifically?
Yeah, for stress and like you were saying, because it has a lot of different effects on the body, as you said, with a sympathetic and the parasympathetic response. But I think some tools that people can use specifically now in relationship to stress and fear, things they maybe like if it's something that would be calming to help from that fight or flight response.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So first of all, to connect back with stress in the immune system, I just want people to understand that it makes total sense. Our immune system, the whole point of it is surveillance. Mm-hmm. So we talk a lot, I've talked a lot today about the brain and the limbic system being showing up, but really the immune system is the body-wide. We're all connected, right? Every system is connected, but it makes sense that our immune system, because our immune system is designed to react to threats. So bacterial threats, viral threats, but also, stress, mental, emotional threats can do that as well. So, the stress and the immune system are intimately tied. So anyway, so I just wanted to say that one point. So to answer your question about what can people do. So first of all, I think identifying how you react is really important, like I said before. So this all starts with awareness, and it all starts with starting to track patterns of what tends to trigger me. Can I start to identify what's triggering me and either remove those triggers if it's possible, or start to understand those triggers in a different way.
Right, exactly.
So what triggers me, and then what's my reaction? And if I'm a person, as I said before, if I'm a person that has to do and be productive and feels my heart racing and feels so sitting in, so I'm a mobilizer. That's what we call it, a mobilizer or fight or flight.
Yep.
So important for me is to feel safe immobilizing.
Yes.
So to stop and to sit. If you're an immobilizer, and we didn't talk as much about this, but that's actually dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system. And if the sympathetic is fight or flight, the parasympathetic is feign, like feigning death.
Right.
And it is a very old reptilian, right? This is what reptiles will do. They play dead.
Right.
Right. And so it has a very actually protective response, because when you play dead or when you pass out, which happens, people dissociate. So there's a spectrum. If you're a parasympathetic responder, you're an immobilizer. And like I said before, you might go blank.
Yeah.
You might dissociate from the situation. You might have a poor memory.
Brain fog.
Brain fog. All of these things are people who are immobilizers. They freeze.
Yeah.
And when you fake death, like let's say, in the animal kingdom, if there's a predator, as prey, if you fake death, you actually slow your heart rate. You slow your blood loss. It's been attacked already, and you close everything in and you pass out. And the point of that is to conserve energy.
Right. So you don't die.
So you don't die. Right. So there are people that respond to stress in this way. And so there might be a lot of people out there that are going, oh my gosh, that's me. And I never resonated with the fight or flight, because that wasn't what happened to me. I just would check out.
Right.
Right. So for those people, it's the best thing to do is to feel safe mobilizing. So dance.
Right. Move your body.
Exercise. Move your body spontaneously. It doesn't have to be a regimented way, but doing some exercise. And the exercise is great for, literally everyone on the planet needs to exercise.
Yes. More.
For their stress. Yes. But in different ways. And it's important for you to know. And I think that and I really hope that this is what naturopathic medicine, the mark that we leave, is that we all need to get better at trusting ourselves.
Yeah, individual.
Because you are your best doctor. You really are. And you go to people like Dr. Lulu and myself because this is kind of the thing that we've focused on, right? And this is what we study, and this is what we're experts in. But you are an expert in your own body.
Exactly.
And only you know exactly how it manifests for you. And so the people that immobilize, doing some dance, putting on music, doing something that will help you move and feel pleasure in movement is the best way. And then what you spoke about with herbs, and I do think when we're under acute stress, sensory installs are very important.
Sensory overload, is that what you mean?
No. Sensory, some type of way to get you into the moment using your senses.
Okay.
Right. So partially, part of this is from Sayat Kali, which is a martial arts that I study. But if you are feeling overwhelmed, what happens partially is our energy gets dispersed.
Right.
We feel overwhelmed, and we need to consolidate it.
Bring it back
bring it back into the body. So it could be really important for some people when they feel this is to put your feet on the ground.
Right. To connect.
Right. Connect to the earth and feel it.
Yeah.
Right? Don't just go stand out there and think about things. Go out there and see if you can feel the blades of grass under your feet. Is the ground wet? Is it dry? Is it warm? Is it moist? Is it cold? And you really dive into and have a full sensory experience of the present moment. Another way you can do it if you can't go outside is to grab an object. So my husband has this cute little dog on his desk. So I would just feel this. I would just notice what I'm feeling. And then as if I was going to describe it to someone.
Like texture and
it feels coarse.
Yeah.
yeah, it's coarse. It's not wet. There's a smooth bottom. It feels like it's in the shape of an animal. Close your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Anything tactile
Right.
can be really helpful when we feel overwhelmed, because it's bringing us and our senses into the present moment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I love how, you talked about connecting with the plants and, being outside in nature, which is just so key. We can change our whole entire moment in time by just taking a breath outside, even if it's not sunny, right?
Absolutely.
It can be a cloudy day or a rainy day or a snowy day, and we can still feel the elements around us and connect to
Yes.
nature.
And it's your intention, right? So I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to go outside, and my intention is to reset.
Yeah. Yeah.
My intention
Reset.
is to
Mm-hmm.
just take a deep breath of fresh air. And really, there's not a lot that you need to do consciously. And I think that that's where we get into a lot of trouble, because
Right.
we want to control everything consciously, and just allowing, like, go outside for your body.
Yeah.
Allow your body to be in the presence of these plants, because the energy that they're putting off,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're taking, these negative ions and
Yep.
in the sun, that's going to naturally reset you. I mean, it really is. It's overused, but it's really true. Like, you need to get out of your own way.
Yeah, exactly.
Allow your body to feel nature, right?
Right. That nature cure, as we talk about in naturopathic medicine, it's like the key to overall health through the entire body. So
Absolutely.
important.
Yep.
I know we could talk for like a million hours, but I am conscious of your time, and I love to wrap things up today. It's been so amazing. I just have one more fun question for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you had an unlimited budget right now, and
Yes.
you could spend it on anything you want to make an impact on the planet, what would it
Oof.
be?
Farms.
Farms. Yes. Love it.
I would probably buy a bunch of land and get, expert farmers, organic farmers, to grow what they do, grow what they grow.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Farming is the best. I love it. I work
Yeah.
out at the Veterans Healing Farm, and
I know.
it's
Yeah.
amazing to have what farming can do for the soul. It's just
It's healing on every level. It's
yeah,
healing for the soul. It's healing for your body. It's healing for the planet. It's healing for other people who eat
yeah,
the food. I mean,
community.
it's just,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, really, like, the reverberation of how we're treating farmers, I think is, and where our farms have gone is a problem,
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, hopefully that's all shifting, and even
Yes,
having a little farm, your own little farm in your backyard, can make a difference too,
absolutely.
right? Or in your community. It doesn't have to be
Yes.
a huge farm, which can be a lot of work.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Is there anything you'd like to talk about for how our listeners can get in touch with you? Should they go to your website? Is that the best way?
Sure. Yeah. I have a website, drkalstein.com. I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Kalstein. And that's probably, I update that more than anything. Like, I'll,
Great.
in real time, I'll put what's going on or what my thoughts are. I'll share what I think is important,
Okay, perfect.
in the news. And yeah, and most everything that I'm doing as far as events, or podcasts or talks or anything, are going to be announced through Instagram. So that's probably the best way to follow along with me.
Okay, and if they want to get an appointment with you to see you for a visit, how should they go
Yeah.
about that?
My website would be the best way, and then they can call the clinic from there.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for your time today. It's been so great. And I look forward to connecting again with you soon.
Thanks, Lulu, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great.